Oh, perfect. As promised, it's 2 minutes past 11, so we'll get started today. Firstly, thanks everyone for joining us. So this webinar, as says, is around strategically mapping your supply risk or cyber risk within your supply chain. So this is the middle part of our series. So yeah, thank you all for joining us. From a housekeeping perspective, as always, these webinars are recorded. We've got an expected runtime today of around about 30 minutes for me and Tom to chat through. And then we'll have a bit of a Q&A at the end as well. Obviously, any questions as we're going through, feel free to add them to the chat. As I said, there's that Q&A section at the end that we can all chat through as well. So from anyone who doesn't know who we are, so we're PureCyber. We're an award-winning cybersecurity company. And we cover 3 pillars of cybersecurity. So we've got the governance side of things, the defensive side of cybersecurity, so the SOC for vulnerability scanning, and then we've also got the offensive side of things, which is more of around the penetration testing and trying to think like an attacker would. You got myself on the webinar today, so I'm John. I'm the Chief Information Risk Officer, and then we've got my colleague Tom.
Well, I'm Tom. I'm our Chief Offensive Security Officer.
As mentioned at the start. So in terms of an agenda today and what we're going to cover, so we're going to look at the supply chain risk. So obviously, being the clever people we are, the first part of our autumn webinar series is all around incident management, incident response. The second part of it is today is around supply chain. So it's almost like we could have predicted what's coming up in the news recently. As I said, today we're going to look at why the supply chain risk matters, real world examples of supply chain incidents, and then what does good look like from a security perspective? What should be the steps that are being put in place? So right at the end, we've got the Q&A. From what we're going to do today, we'll go briefly over sort of what's happening at the moment, a couple of examples and why that supply chain risk does matter. Then what we're going to do is tie that all back to sort of real world examples. So as Tom's going to talk through some real life security incidents that have occurred over the past year that have affected the supply chain, and then go through those as well. So I think what we'll do is we'll go through sort of a couple of the recent examples that have appeared in the news. So I don't know, Tom, whether you wanted to chat through these.
Yeah, of course. I think some of these we'll chat through in a little bit more detail later on. So I'll just do some passing comments. But some of these, if not all of them, you should be pretty familiar with. We've got Jaguar Land Rover, probably one of the biggest and most public data breaches that's happened recently. Huge impact on both JLR, its employees, anybody who wants to buy themselves a nice new Land Rover, but also their suppliers in terms of the people that are making the parts for them. We've got M&S then in the bottom corner, another really big name in the retail space that was breached earlier on this year. And then there's probably a few others on here that you may not have heard of. Thinking of Adidas or Adidas, depending on where you're from, is obviously a sportswear company. And in this case, the breach contained a load of customer data. And it was where one of their third parties, in fact, their customer service provider, had a breach. And that left a load of their customers' data exposed to the real world. In the example of Peter Green Chilled Foods, another really good example of where they're one cog in a much bigger machine. Obviously, their aim is to deliver fresh and chilled produce across the UK, and a cyber incident that affected them may have put on extra stress and strain both to their business operations, but also to some of their suppliers who are ultimately producing things like fruit and veg, and whether that would have spoiled in the transport to its end destination, such as a supermarket. And then we've got things like Aston Villa Football Club, where they have a membership platform where members or their fans can register for various different perks. And instead of managing that themselves, they outsource that through their supply chain to a third party, in theory, that does the job a lot better than they ever could internally. And a bit of problematic management there with how that supply chain was operating led to some of their members' details being exposed in something called an S3 bucket. So I think quite a few interesting supply chain attacks, and we'll dig into some of those bigger ones later on, particularly JLR, the Collins Aerospace, so the airport side of things.
I'm pretty sure there's been a couple more recently since we've done these slides, haven't there, Tom? So you've had Harrods, I believe, was another one that's come through. Sales Loft is another one that's come through. It's affecting the supply chain.
Yeah, there was a big one the other day, and once again, it's a lot of these are sometimes quite hard to get good, quick information on really quickly after the fact because, like everything, people are going to try not to spread information. I mean, businesses want to deal with things to manage their supply chain risk, so it can be quite difficult. And obviously, the information we work off here is a lot of the stuff that comes out in the public domain because obviously what we don't want to do is spread misinformation. So a lot of it is going to be talking around what happened, where it happened, how it happened, and ultimately what businesses could do to prevent a similar attack impacting them.
That's it. And I think it's really important when you look at some of these sort of facts around from the NCSC as well. So as it says there, only 13% of UK businesses review the risks posed by their immediate supply chain, and 7% assess the wider supply chain as well. So where we mean about that is obviously you'll have your key suppliers and your sort of immediate ones within there, but then you want to branch that net out as much as you can and see what you can capture. Again, another quote from the NCSC side of things is it's vital for organizations to sort of work with their suppliers to identify the critical risks, the appropriate security measures as well. Now, there's not one size fits all with this. It is a sort of an ongoing process to really identify where your suppliers' biggest risks are, where your biggest risks are as a company. It's something we always come back to with a lot of our webinars is where's the data? Why is it important? What's the risk of that data and who's got access to it? And again, that's where you almost start with your supply chain risk management, which we'll come on to a bit later on. It's very important to kind of look at, as I said, I think from an NCSC perspective and some of the stats we've also picked up, there's been a 200% increase on supply chain attacks over the past year. Again, 30% of the breaches have involved key third parties. So it's one of those areas which is just on the rise. And I think that's because of the interconnectivity of how we sort of live our lives on a daily basis. Obviously within the business and how much sort of applications you use, how many systems you use, how many integrations you use, that risk is just going to kind of keep growing and growing and growing. Now I'm going to let Tom talk about the image in this slide because it's one of his favorite images that he's ever come across before. But I think again, you look at the sort of the top level side of the stats there is that 46% of organizations have experienced at least two supply chain related incidents in the past year. Not saying that they're catastrophic incidents, not saying they're to the level of JLR, but there is some sort of cyber incident that's happened in the supply chain. Tom, do you want to talk through the picture and how it relates to the first point on that slide initially?
Yeah, of course. So I think some of you may recognize at least the picture or possibly the styling of the picture. This come from I'm going to call it a bit more of a nerdy or geeky magazine called XKCD a couple of years ago, and I think for me sums up in a really good image how the internet or modern companies or dependencies these days are all self-reliant on each other and effectively we're all lazy. We don't do things from scratch because why would we? Why would we reinvent the wheel, so to speak, when somebody else has done that probably much better than we all could ourselves? So instead, we rely on supply chains. We used to rely on third parties to do those bits for us. And what this image effectively shows is that one of those building blocks could be that weak link in your entire tech stack. Whether that it be in one of the examples we'll look at later on in terms of reduced visibility in one component being breached. It could be just one of those bits in your supply chain going down. And we can look at this image from multiple different perspectives, both as a technical human and probably from an operational perspective, and understand, for example, what happens if an outage happened. Just yesterday, Vodafone had a massive outage across the UK for all of their sort of mobile telephone and broadband customers. It could have been Vodafone with that one puzzle piece that made everything else crumble. It doesn't necessarily mean it was a breach. It doesn't necessarily mean it was something that caused your business problems, but it could have been that thing that made you have to reevaluate your sort of operational standpoint and instigate things like BCP plans.
I think it mainly relates to that first point, doesn't it, Tom, around the access to critical systems. Now that could be, let's have a critical system that you've incorporated that comes into your supply chain. I think that's where we talk about with Collins Aerospace, isn't it, later on, and how
It
that was a
does.
critical component.
Yeah, I think all three of these are interesting sort of supply chain attacks, or at least supply chain impacts. And I think as we go through some of our examples later on in a little bit more detail, I think, John, if you're happy, we'll dig into probably each of these in a bit more detail and what it is, how it sort of got to that visibility state, and obviously what you can do about it.
Yeah. Absolutely fine. And I suppose what we'll try and do is we'll go through those in a bit more detail, because I think the examples are really, really key within this webinar, because it shows the real world life of how these three sort of bullet points fit in. But I think what we're going to do now is something we're trying to do a lot more of these webinars, is sort of ask a question to everyone. So there should be a question coming across through into the chat shortly, into the Q&A section. So, and this is again, anonymous side of things. So who reviews the risk within their supply chain at the moment?
In 50-50 at the moment.
And we do, we don't, we do. Yeah, you're looking at about,
Near enough 50-50, which is, I think, a really interesting balance.
I mean, if it ends on 50-50, I'll think this is fixed. But yeah, if it had ended up on 50-50, of course it did. So, okay, really, really interesting way of looking about that. And then if we ask a follow-up question to it, who has a continuous supplier assessment process, or who only reviews the risk at onboarding? Obviously, we'll have some of the ones who answered that they don't do a supplier risk assessment at the neither side of things. And I think what's really interesting here is that the majority are coming in at the at onboarding stage. Um, so obviously great from a perspective of having that initial view on it, but I suppose that continuous assessment is the one that we'll probably emphasize a little bit more of as we come later down into what good looks like, of having that continuous monitoring of them. This is where me and Tom get to talk about sub-processes and AI models, which we won't go into too much detail on, because I'm sure everyone's fed up of having an AI conversation constantly, but it's a really interesting viewpoint from that as well. Okay, cool. No, that's great. And I think, yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. It's 50-50 in terms of actually doing it and not doing it, but then that continuous viewpoint seems to have dropped quite a bit as well. So I think what we'll do is we'll go through sort of some of the supply chain attacks that we've picked up on. So these are three examples that we've picked up for this webinar, which are to talk through those three initial points. So around the reduced visibility and control, around the critical access to systems, and around the sort of reputational impact as well. There's probably some more that we can talk about within here, which we probably will reference others as well, but these are the ones that we've picked out for today. So I'm going to hand over to Tom now, who's going to talk through each attack, the root cause of it, what happened, and I suppose we'll have a conversation then around each one about what could have been done to prevent it as well. So over to you, Tom.
Perfect. I think this is probably a really good place to start. So this looks back to that diagram we saw a couple of slides ago of the blocks building on top of each other. In this case, this is what we referred to as a dependency hijack, and basically that's where one of those Lego bricks in the house or in the foundation was compromised by an attacker, whether that was intentionally in terms of them injecting malicious code, or possibly whether that would be accidentally in terms of that code just not performing as expected, a fault or an error occurring, which caused downstream problems. In this particular case, 3CX is a like a telephone provider, so they allow you to have effectively mobile communication VoIP phones over the internet. And as part of their 3CX software package, they build on tops of lots of different libraries. So that, again, they don't build everything from the ground up internally. They pull software in from third-party vendors. And what happened in this exact incident was one of those packages was effectively compromised. So this actually occurred back in around 2023. there was a theoretical attribution of this back to a North Korean threat actor. But once again, knowing exactly how this occurred is actually quite difficult. But effectively, one of those components of the larger 3CX ecosystem was compromised. And that was automatically then pulled into 3CX's build process. So as they released version 1.1 of their application, newer versions of all the libraries were pulled down. They were packaged into the 3CX application, which was then distributed out to all of their customers. Now, in this case, it's really hard to say exactly what went wrong. Yes, there was a poisoned or a malicious package injected, but actually it can be very difficult to say for certain when that's going to occur, because the honest answer is, if you think your software may have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lines of code in it, each of those independent dependencies that you pull in may also have that much complexity. And the honest answer is your engineers are probably not going to be going through each of those lines of code individually to look for something that's gone wrong or has been injected. However, that doesn't mean you can't do anything. And so what we're going to look at here is two potential solutions of how this could be prevented. One of them from a 3CX perspective as the supplier, and the second one from an end user as a customer perspective of 3CX on how you could mitigate the risk. So from a 3CX perspective, the approach here is twofold. First of all, introducing additional steps in your release cycle. So that would be where you're doing things such as static code analysis to review the entire product in terms of its dependency tree to look for technical compromises. So looking out there for known malicious hashes that are injected into there, or bits of code that don't necessarily fit the full life cycle. And there's some brilliant tools out there that can do that automatically as part of a sort of a CI/CD pipeline. And that might have caught this in this instance, but you never know. It could have been designed well enough that it still slipped through the net. So the next solution to this is actually a 3CX and an end user perspective. And it's all around actually how we roll things out. Now, we do know that attacks are getting quicker. It used to be we had patching policies that were 30 days. The general practice now is that's coming down to 14 days. And if I'm honest, I wouldn't be surprised if that got shorter down to 7 days or even less, because ultimately what we're doing is we're seeing attackers get quicker and quicker at exploiting vulnerabilities. But that doesn't necessarily mean what we should do is push things out without testing. And what would have probably saved 3CX, at least to an element here, is to have what we would refer to as deployment rings. So where their software is put through both functionality testing, but also sort of security, availability, confidentiality testing. So where that new release, for example, is run out to a small group of individuals, a staging group, as long as everything goes well there within, say, 24 hours, and tracking various different metrics. It then gets rolled out to a larger group, an alpha test group, and then a beta test group, and then finally out to all users. The vast advantage of doing this sort of deployment strategy, yes, it slows down your patching, but it does mean in the instance like we had last year with CrowdStrike, or in this instance with 3CX, if there was something wrong with that new software update, what effectively happens is that you're minimizing that impact. If it causes problems on your customer systems and you get a huge wave of tickets coming in, you know, actually, look, we want to stop this release, roll back and start to review that. So thinking about how you can mitigate some of these risks in your own business, as well as just what the supplier in this case could do.
Yep, that's right, Tom. And again, this sort of relates back to that reduced visibility and control, doesn't it? Obviously, you don't have visibility as a customer of that supplier around what they're doing in terms of patching or what they're doing in terms of their software development life cycle, but you have the control to push it out at your speed and at your leisure. So let's use another example, iOS 26. Let's use that as a great example. Something that's recently come out, first update that's come out, have you pushed that to everyone straight away who's using Max in the organization, or have you held back and done, as Tom said, through those update cycles? That's the element of control you can have within that supply chain from a reduced visibility side of things. There's again another interesting side of things to look at, and then we sort of move on to there, which probably looks more at the reputational operational impact, doesn't it, Tom, of suppliers and supply chain attacks? If you want to chat through what probably people have heard quite a lot about.
Yeah, I think if you haven't heard about JLR, you're definitely living under a rock. But I think JLR is for me, not so much an interest in cyber attack because of how it happened. I think, once again, we don't know the full story at the present time, but the theory at the moment is that a valid set of credentials were exposed, whether that would be through something like phishing email or info stealer malware. Effectively, a real employee within JLR's access was stolen. That was then used to access internal systems. And over a prolonged period of time, possibly days, weeks, months, or even years, the attackers worked their way throughout JLR's infrastructure to understand their systems, where things happened, and ultimately, when the time came to deploy, in this case, ransomware, which caused a huge outage. For me, there's a load of learning points here. The first one is what they do in terms of employee awareness training, so phishing simulations making employees more robust. In terms of access control, minimizing access control. There's a huge amount for me here around actual just general network architecture, and some of the reports are coming out that it's taking JLR so long to recover because their environment was so complex, and it's just really hard for someone to unpick it. And I always think keep it super simple. The KISS principle is one that's always worth looking at, because the moment you make something complex and hard to understand, not only does it make it hard to maintain, but it makes it hard to sort of, in this case, recover from. But I think the big bit I want to cover on JLR is not so much the attack itself, but more the impact. And understanding that JLR really sit in the middle of this giant web of both suppliers and supply chain. In this case, we talk about supply chain risk of what are the people that provide services to you as a business. But in JLR's case, they were a supplier. They provided cars and parts to various different businesses and individuals around the world. But also they had people feeding into them. JLR operate under something called a GIT, just-in-time manufacturing. So when they're building a car on their production line, somehow shortly beforehand, the bonnet and the wheels and all of the component parts turn up. And all of them come from other manufacturers around the UK. So in this case, the outage of JLR hasn't just mean that they can't make any more cars and their production lines have stopped. And that obviously has an impact on all of the employees and downstream customers. Actually, there's a load of people upstream of JLR in this case that may have made parts for them. And that's why you saw the UK government step in around things like support programs and funding, because really the impact of JLR not buying bonnets and wheels means that a lot of other businesses who weren't directly impacted by this cyber attack may have had huge impacts to their business, the ability to actually buy or sell products. And ultimately, that's what the UK government was looking at in terms of trying to mitigate not the JLR part of this attack, but actually trying to mitigate the onward impact to the rest of the economy.
I think it was a very similar one for that just in time with the Peter Green chilled. I remember watching on the news, there was a honey farmer that basically had to dump a bucket load of honey because they couldn't actually deliver it to anyone at the supermarket because of Peter Green chilled being exploited as well. So there's that pattern there around when you're in that middle of a supply chain, like Tom said, and having that sort of up and downstream situation, how impactful it can be to smaller suppliers as well. And for our final sort of example we wanted to look at was the Collins Aerospace one. So again, this kind of highlights the indirect access to critical systems, which over to you, Tom, because I know you enjoyed this one. Not in terms of an attack, in terms of actually the research behind it.
Yeah, I enjoyed this one both in terms of an attack, but also in terms of the impact. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we should bring airports down, but I think actually this attack showed once again a really interesting tangent between sort of reliance on single points of failure and actually just generally businesses not doing organization impact assessments and on continuity planning well. For those of you who don't know, earlier this, well, it was just the end of last month, wasn't it, John? September. Collins Aerospace, a subsidiary of a company RTX or Raytheon, produce a platform called Muse, or what they refer to as a multi-user system environment. Effectively, when you turn up to the airport and you go to the check-in or the baggage carousels, those are likely to all be sort of Muse terminals. Long gone are the days where BA and Lufthansa all had their own separate check-in desks. What happens now is the airport provides those check-in desks, and effectively the different airlines, I'm going to use the word, rent them out and can use the same physical infrastructure to check people in for flights, regardless of which airline you're flying on. And that was all made possible because of this sort of Muse system or other alternatives very similar to it. That's effectively the background here. What actually happened? Well, it looks as if there was a vulnerability in the Muse product. And once again, the details are not fully clear at the moment of exactly what happened, but a third-party vulnerability in the Muse platform, which allowed attackers to effectively get in, cause damage, and ultimately deploy ransomware. Now, I think this is a really good example, not necessarily because of, once again, what happened, but also some of the decisions that a business would have to make when they went to choose a supplier. So in this case, Collins Aerospace didn't actually just produce one version of Muse. They produced two. They produce a cloud-hosted version of Muse, the C Muse, as they refer to it as, and an on-premise deployment, or what they would refer to as their older deployment, called vMuse. Now, although the software here in practice is exactly the same, thinking about the risks of either approach is actually a really interesting one when you're onboarded a supplier. Now, obviously, having the cloud hosted version of Muse was great. All of the airports could, for example, connect on that one shared instance. It's managed by RTX or Raytheon or Collins, whatever you want to refer to them as. They patch it, they maintain it, you just pay them a subscription fee, and they're happy. Great, easy. But the problem is what you have there is basically a single point of failure. If something goes wrong, in this case, in this publicly exposed cloud deployment, all of the airports are impacted. Likewise, the other option, having an on-premise deployment, means that each airport, in this case, would have their own on-premise installation. Now, this is a bit more challenging to think of. You may need to provide resource in terms of IT. You may need to provide hardware for it to run on. Obviously, you may need to segregate it from the wider network so it lives in some sort of isolated zone. And all of these are great security practices for deploying software. That does mean that each airport operates in its own isolated silo. So in theory, an attack on one won't necessarily mean attack on all of them. But in this case, it wasn't quite that simple. As you can see by the dotted lines, all of these systems were still managed by Raytheon or Collins. So they all had, I'm not going to call them backdoors, but a lot of those airports also had support contracts where they could phone up Collins, for example, and say, we've got a problem with our system. And one of their engineers would remote in through a jump box and manage those environments. So although these are two very different sort of deployments, both have associated risks. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing quite regularly now is businesses are moving things from on-premise to the cloud. And that's not necessarily good or bad. It just changes your risk profile, and that's something you've always got to think of. But I think the key bit about this attack that I want to cover is actually on the next slide, and this is around how airports dealt with this problem. In this case, looking at some of the airports affected, and we've chosen 4 here in as an example: Heathrow, Brussels, Berlin, and Dublin. 4 of them that were publicly known to have been impacted by this, although I'm sure the list is actually much larger. Basically, the impact for these airports really, for me, depended on not so much on their reliance on the Muse platform, but how well they had alternatives in place. So thinking back to business continuity planning, what happens if something went wrong? In this case, the Muse platform falling over. How can your business operations continue to run? Now, we can see some of the stats on here. For example, Heathrow reckons over 1,000 computers corrupted. Brussels reckon at least 50% of their flights were cancelled. Dublin, for example, had severe impacts even 3 days after the initial deployment. In this case, you can see some of the stats around saw them rebuilding servers, which indicated they may have had an on-premise deployment. But the honest answer is here, looking at how people reacted really helped in this case. So, for example, in Heathrow, you can see their staff deployed emergency protocols and shifted to manual check-ins. Now, don't get me wrong, that's never going to be as efficient as a fully nice working automated system, but they still were able to let planes take off. In Berlin, there was a great photo that you can see in the bottom right hand corner where they were actually physically writing boarding passes by hand, which can't have been the most efficient. It probably huge waiting times and delays for manual check-ins, but they still kept going. And ultimately, the systems did get back up and running. A few days later, things got fixed, and life did get back to normal. But thinking about this ahead of time in terms of what would you do if one of your bits of software in your supply chain or one of your suppliers had a problem in terms of an outage, in terms of its availability, in terms of the data that they have access to, in terms of a confidentiality or integrity impact. How would your business continue its operation? How would you manage it? And ultimately, if you could do that before something bad happens, when that thing eventually does happen, because normally it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and to what severity. At that point, then you're going to be in a really good place to deal with it.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Tom. It's almost like having a supply chain webinar and risk management supply chain after incident management and incident response was almost pre-planned by us. Very, very clever of us. But yeah, it's and that's it, isn't it? It's knowing what that risk is going to be. Like Tom said, you could have used the cloud environment, you could have used the on-premise environment with Collins Aerospace as an airport, but about having that risk review to say, well, this could be a risk with that, that could be a risk with this. How do we mitigate against that, and what's the best way of coming around it? There's a really interesting one that we kind of wanted to go through before we go into the section where we talk about what kind of good looks like. Is obviously from the people who reference that they do security due diligence across their supply chain. Has anyone ever rejected anyone as part of that process? This is a really interesting one. There's no right or wrong answer here, but it's something that we talked about because, okay, yep, straight away somebody did. There's a really interesting one because I think sometimes you can do the due diligence and most companies in terms of, or some companies, and there could be instances, couldn't there, Tom, where you accept that risk because you need it as a critical part of a function, or it's going to help improve the business by doing X, Y, and Z. So it's about having that process in place to make sure that that sort of risk is mitigated as best as it can, but still doesn't sort of detrimentally impact the business in any way.
I think you're the governance expert from this side of things, but I think you're right. It's ultimately everything is a risk calculation. It's that seesaw, isn't it, of balancing risk versus reward. And ultimately, you could accept the most insecure, vulnerable piece of software that's going to bring your business down, and you could manage it in other ways. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to reject it, but sometimes there are going to be so many red flags that actually you think maybe using a different supplier might be the easy option.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, it's pretty even split there between yes, no, and not sure.
I mean, the bit I think is interesting there is the not sure is almost 50% of the vote, and that might be a really interesting one of obviously different demographics of the people we've got on the call today. But it's interesting there that people aren't really sure whether things are rejected or not. So that might be a thing to feed back into that sort of whole change management process of feedback. If decisions are made, why have they been made, and making sure that that's a cyclic cycle so everybody feels invested.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And I think it's that openness and transparency across the organization, isn't it, around supply chain and why you accept certain things and why you don't others, and what your logic behind it is, and if there is anything you can do that helps, again, helps the whole business in general. Because I think in terms of what sort of security due diligence looks like now, I imagine that if we take some of the people who are doing due diligence of the onboarding process within the answers earlier, I imagine majority, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, and that would be doing due diligence questionnaires. So sending out a questionnaire to somebody to ask them what they're doing and how they're doing it and what their security controls are. Now, I have a personal opinion on these as whether they are enough or not. And something that I talk about quite a lot with Tom is yes, a due diligence questionnaire is great, but you are getting a snapshot of that organization in their best possible light. Because if you ask them if they patch within 14 days for critical and high, I don't think many would say no. I'm completely honest. I think they would probably say yes and hope you don't question it on them later on. I think it's a really interesting one with due diligence questionnaires, and we get a lot of them, is how much information you put in there, what the information is they're asking, and also have they ever reviewed? That's another one that I find quite often is a questionnaire will come out and you can put an answer in there that you know isn't going to be correct and not what they want to hear. Does anyone ever question you coming back on it? That's a really interesting thing from anyone here who has filled out those due diligence questionnaires. Has anyone ever come back to you and asked to clarify any of the points within there? Because I don't think I've had it, and I've put some very rogue answers in some of ours, because we don't want to share our policies. So whenever anyone asks for a policy, I always say, nope, we're not going to share it, but we'll happily jump on a call and run through it with you, because I don't want our policies in another system. Now, nobody's ever come back to me and said, can we have a call to run through your policies? It's a very interesting point there. Go on, Tom.
And to pick up off that, you mean we talk about due diligence questionnaires, some people say, have you got ISO 27001 or Cyber Essentials? And that is probably sometimes the only tick box in your sort of cybersecurity onboarding. And don't get me wrong, they're really important pieces of the puzzle, but things like JLR had Cyber Essentials. And ultimately, what we're not saying is Cyber Essentials is going to be the thing that's going to fix all your problems. It is fundamentally the sort of 5 key fundamental controls that are going to put you in a better place than where you are now. But ultimately, it doesn't fix everything. And I have no doubt that IASME and the NCSC are probably going through JLR's Cyber Essentials certification to go, is there anything in here that would indicate what happened? And ultimately, sometimes a questionnaire in itself might not be enough. So what other things can we do, John?
Well, I think there's you bring on a point there around 27,001 Cyber Essentials, IASME. There's a lot of organizations in the world who have had 27,001 and end up in breaches previously. Again, it's just one of those things. And I think that continuous monitoring is something that I'd always put in place and something that we'd want to cover off because, like you say, it's great doing that due diligence at the start. Really good process to have. But if you're not maintaining that on an annual basis as a minimum, because of the rate of changes within organizations, the rate of their risk will change massively as well. It's one of the things that I wanted to bring up, and I didn't want to mention AI, but we will. If you think of, and it's something that we've noticed recently, applications that you may previously have gone through due diligence now have developed their own inbuilt AI tools, which then suddenly means that your supply chain has another supply chain of it. So we had an example recently with one of our suppliers who we've been using for years, introduced an AI component. That AI component had sub processors within Azure, AWS, within Google Cloud. They had another sub processor somewhere else. And it was like, well, hold on a minute. Now suddenly that tool that we approved legitimately said, we put all the controls in place, created their own AI tool, which was then spreading out across the web into different areas. And you're like, well, obviously with the introduction of those systems, you've got to constantly make sure that they are being reviewed, they are being monitored, and they are being assessed again, because you could turn around and say, well, actually, we're not comfortable with that risk anymore of that supplier because of X, Y, and Z. We need to change it, or we need to either you need to change it for supplier, or you need to come up with new controls that are going to be put in place to mitigate that risk as much as you can.
That was
It's
exactly the sort of thing that happened with the Aston Villa breach. They brought on that supplier to manage their membership platform, and their membership platform was migrated, as far as I'm aware, from one software platform to another. And as part of that migration, the vendor decided they'd take a backup, which is a great idea to do, but unintentionally they'd stored that backup in a publicly exposed S3 bucket on the web on Amazon, and that meant somebody managed to find that open bucket and see all that data. So it's an interesting one. That change management piece may not have been problematic, but actually the process they had behind doing it actually then caused further downstream problems.
Yeah, and everyone laughs at me when they see my supply chain risk register internally because it is an absolute. I'm going to use the word cacophony, which I think is probably the best word I can think of, and Tom will laugh if I say that, of risks, impacts, whether it impacts us daily, whether it impacts us from a data point of view, a business continuity point of view, how many dependencies fall off the back of it. And I'm now adding in a new column to identify sub-processes that falls into it. But I have a impact matrix, then it goes into a internal assurance. So what we've done to mitigate that risk. Then we look at external assurance. I think it ends up going into column. I think it's BH at the moment in terms of an Excel document, in terms of like how far these columns go across. But it's something that we have to do to make sure that we're on top of everything that we've got. And that we're doing the best we can to make sure our supply chain is as robust from a security perspective as possible. Because really, I mean, when you think of what good looks like, and it's something we brought in right at the very start, is it's all about knowing what data you have, where is it stored, who has access to it, what would be the impact if it was compromised, and how are you protecting it. They're the 5 sort of key things you'd look at from a data perspective, and it all starts with almost putting in like a framework around how you're running your security. So making sure that you have a process in place that you know where all your assets are kept. This is the fundamentals of things like IASME level, IASME cyber assured level 1 is having an asset register, knowing where that data is, knowing how it's protected, and knowing what the impact is against it, and then producing that business continuity, that supply chain risk assessment off the back of it as well. I mean, when we started doing our supply chain due diligence, it was back 4 or 5 years ago when I joined, we looked at initially going, right, if company is Cyber Essentials Plus or equivalent, we're happy with them as an organization because they've put the right sort of measures in place. But then when we looked at it and we realized, well, some of the companies who don't have Cyber Essentials Plus, who we were working with as suppliers, they didn't have the data risk that others do. So why would we hold them to the same standard? And it's about knowing that, well, actually, the data they have is very, very minimal. From an impact perspective, we wouldn't have loads of issues. Data stored is in a local sort of storage facility. Again, minimal access for data, we can protect it. We don't have to put them through the same level of due diligence as somebody like Microsoft 365, for example, which holds a lot of data. So it's about knowing where those intricacies lie, and making sure that you continuously monitor it, because it does change on a, at the moment, daily basis, really, doesn't it, Tom?
Yeah, and I think ultimately, for me, it's sometimes it's zooming out, thinking back to that CIA triad that we always go on about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And if you apply that to any supplier that you're working with, what would happen if the data that they had access to was no longer confidential? What happens if the data they had access to was no longer trusted, its integrity was broken? Or what happens if the data that they had access to either went away in terms of availability or was breached out to a wider audience, and how you as a business would go about that? You can put that risk rating on there. And as John said, yeah, right, not everybody's on a level playing field. For example, the person who supplies coffee for the coffee machine might be one of our highest risk suppliers, because without it, the rest of the team will crumble. It
And
may
the
not
most
have a
vital.
huge, exactly, and it may not have a huge confidentiality problem or an integrity problem, but the availability problem in that case is going to be massive.
Exactly that. And I think I've just realized that we've talked for quite some time, Tom. I think I've overestimated a half hour that we were going to talk through this. So we'll go through the rest as quickly as we can, because I appreciate people are busy. But I suppose what I wanted to do, and what we're trying to do more, we've got a word cloud poll, because these are my favorite things to look at the moment, is what's your sort of key takeaway from today? What have you picked up on? What is that key takeaway? I'm hoping one of those in there is make sure that you do due diligence on your coffee supplier. Lovely. Keep it simple, stupid, I think is my favorite one there from a KISS perspective. Monitoring, upstream in depth, the triangle. So that's the confidentiality side of things, integrity and availability. I think the monitoring one is probably one that's coming up the most from everyone here. Again, monitoring, due diligence, ongoing monitoring. So we're going to group those together. We've got 4 for the monitoring. It is that constant viewpoint of it, isn't it? And it's exactly the same as what you do with everything else: continuous review, ongoing monitoring. It's sadly nowadays, from a due diligence perspective on a lot of things, is that constant monitoring. If you even think of people like, let's go for a little bit of a weird analogy, because why not? Food Standards Agency. Let's use them as an example. You think of those 5 stars that you see across restaurants, that is a continuous monitoring of it. They don't allow a restaurant to open, audit them once, and then in 5 years' time think they're probably still the same as where they were last time. It is that continuous monitoring. And if Gordon Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares in the USA has taught me, a restaurant that starts initially really well will not be the same 3 years down the line. But luckily, if you have Gordon Ramsay on your side, your restaurant turns around and becomes better. So it is that kind of constant key takeaway if we look at it, really. And again, I suppose it's what you can do. So, there's loads of things that you can do from a supply chain viewpoint, I suppose, from a governance perspective. There's obviously governance reviews. I think what is key for us at Pure Cyber, and what me and Tom talk about quite a lot, is making sure that you have that framework in place that is relevant and applicable to you as an organization. It's probably the best way of putting it. So making sure that you have a process around your asset management, your due diligence around things like that, making sure that your supply chain has a due diligence process, that your change management has a process, that everything feeds into one central repository where everyone knows from who everyone who needs to know knows what's going on from that perspective and has a process in place. Because like we always say, it's knowing where the data is, knowing where it sits. And if you identify where your data is, who has access to it, and what the impact is, then suddenly you can start creating your due diligence questionnaires off the back of it. You can create your instant response processes, your business continuity, your supply chain risk assessments, your risk assessments in general. Everything comes from data because everything is data led. I think that's one of the key things that we'd look at. Obviously, supply chain risk assessments is key takeaways we'd look at from today's webinar. And again, it's not just, I suppose, sending out a questionnaire and being happy that you've got responses back. You know, review them, see where the risks lie, and see what you can do against it. The penetration testing one is an interesting one, which I think Tom can elaborate on a little bit as well. But obviously, you can conduct penetration testing against suppliers if you ask their permission. You can ask to see their recent penetration testing results if you ask for them. It's about knowing what asking and seeing what they'll provide you, really, isn't it, Tom?
Yeah, and ultimately, we appreciate that not everybody is going to be a technical expert. And if you're a customer with a asset here at PureCyber, if you are onboarding a new supplier and you've got their penetration test report, and you want us just to cast our eye over it and provide you some general feedback around sort of technical risk, feel free to reach out, because ultimately that's what we're here for. We're here to provide you that sort of outsourced security team.
Yeah. And like I said initially around that framework, if you don't have the correct framework in place and you do something like that, then there's nowhere for it to really go. It doesn't get fed up to the business owners. It doesn't get fed down to the employees who want to implement the supplier. It's about having that full transparent process between everyone. One of the other ones that we're seeing quite a lot recently is around supply chain instant response simulations. Now, I know in the previous webinar we talked about conducting an instant response simulation. Again, there's no reason why you couldn't conduct one based on one of your suppliers and one of the key risks within those suppliers. So what data they potentially hold, and focusing really in on that supply chain due diligence. Because what you might find is that yes, you've got a supplier, yes, you've identified it's got access to critical data, but that relationship with that supplier is held up by one person and one person only. So what happens when they leave the business, or they're on holiday or something like that? And then that's again a weakness within your instant response simulation, which, if you come back to Tom's favorite cartoon, is that critical component around your tech stack and your supply chain and the way that you do business. There's loads of options that you can do. And again, I think it's just the key takeaway from today is making sure that you are doing the due diligence assessments, making sure you're assessing your suppliers, and also making sure that's on an ongoing basis rather than just a one-off. I think me and Tom will stop talking there because we've talked quite a bit. But I suppose we'll open it up to the floor to see if there's any questions around what we've talked about or anything that anybody wanted to raise. I'll go back to our word cloud and see if there's anything in there we can bring in. Okay, brilliant. So there's a question there. So how can you manage or coordinate suppliers that might operate under different privacy data laws in different countries? What a lovely question to start with. Go on, Tom. I'll let you go for this one.
I can answer that. The
I
honest
know you
answer
can.
is I don't really care where you or your supplier are. Yes, there are bits of legislation that may come in, particularly things like German companies or EU companies may have restrictions on what data can be transferred in and out of certain geographical regions. But ultimately, for me, it's not about where the company is. It's all about how you use that company and how they fit into you. So what data are you giving them? Where is it stored and who needs access? If you can sort of zoom out and understand the sort of those sort of the who, the what, the where, the when, and the why, ultimately you're going to be able to put a good risk management profile around something, regardless of where that country is based, whether it's in the UK, the US, or Antarctica.
Lovely. That's a soundbite I want you to do constantly, Tom, is who, the what, the where, the why, and the how. And again, with that, I suppose it all comes back to a contractual basis as well. Like, what privacy and data laws are you operating under? Because you might have a contract with them, but under UK law, it might be US, or like Tom said, it might be Antarctica. What would you say are the biggest red flags are when trying to review supplier security controls and processes? So I think the biggest red flags, I mean, I suppose it's a very interesting one, back because it'll all depend on the type of data they hold and what they do hold. Obviously, if they're holding critical data and they have no security due diligence at all, and they have no security controls in place their side, that would be a big red flag for me. If they have um, constant access to systems and applications that you're using, that would be another big red flag from my point of view. I think one of the biggest ones are people who don't want to answer any other questions. That would be again, a really big one there. I don't know if you've got any other thoughts, Tom.
That was going to be my answer, where they come back and say, we've got ISO 27001, we don't need to provide an answer to this question. Or if somebody being a little bit of avoiding a topic or a subject is normally, ultimately, it may not be a pass or fail, but ultimately you're asking the question for a reason on your side, and someone who doesn't want to answer normally is trying to probably hide something.
How do we approach big suppliers like Microsoft where it's unrealistic? So, I mean, yeah, unrealistic. So I think the good thing about big suppliers is a lot of them have things on the back end of their websites now called like trust centers, where you can get all of this information, and they are very open and public about what they share. They will share various information about their recent ISO reports and what they found for non-compliance is what they need to improve on, because it shows that element of trust within the supply chain. The way that we approach it, again, we hate the mix of the external assurance, so what we get from trust centers, so their certificate levels, what they've got in place, things like that. But then we've also got the other side of it where we look at our internal controls around that supplier. So for Microsoft, if we use that as an example, are we reliant on their backups, or are we reliant on our backups within that data set? Obviously, we do it all on our own backups. So we have a third-party system that backs up all of Microsoft because we've taken that control element internally. Again, things like multi-factor authentication, single sign-on. We've got things like our SOC monitors and 24/7. I appreciate that's different for other people, but can you have that continuous monitoring in place around that environment? So I think it's a mix of the internal and the external, really, from my point of view. I don't know if you've got any other thoughts on that, Tom.
No, I think you are right. It's sometimes it can be difficult, but I think still apply the same KISS principles, keep things simple, apply that sort of risk mitigation approach, and ultimately you'll fall somewhere. Even if you don't have all the answers, you can get 80 or 90% of the way there.
Perfect. And then from Tom's question, so template or open source asset register or supplier questionnaire you can share. Yes, I'm sure we can. I'm looking at our marketing team now and they're nodding and shaking their head at the same time. So yes, we do have templates and registers and stuff like that we can share as part of this. So I believe at the end of the webinar, and once the recording comes out, there's a supplier due diligence question, sort of checklist that you want to put in place. Obviously, off the back of that, if there's any additional help that you would need or any extra guidance, then yes, we can ask and we can help out with that. That's not a problem at all. Are there any other questions or anything else anybody wanted to talk about, chat through? I just want to hear Tom do his soundbite of how, what, the who, the what, the where, the how, and the why.
I'm not doing it again.
It's fine. I'll go back to the recording and I'll save that anyway. Perfect. So I think that's everything from today's session. So I suppose from our side, again, thank you so much for joining us today and for chatting through, or for listening to me and Tom chat through supplier due diligence. As a recording will be sent to all of the registrants from today. So for anyone in your organisation who didn't manage to get on, they'll still be able to receive a recording later on. As I said, we've got a supply chain sort of risk and resilience resources that will come out. So they're going to be checklists, they're going to be advice around how to do it. And again, if there's any extra questions or anything off the back of it you want to ask, then you're more than welcome to reach out and we can help as much as we can. One thing we probably pick up on from today as well, obviously it's Cybersecurity Awareness Month at the moment. So if you head to our website, you will see the ripple effect. So there's a phishing quiz across our website that we can look at, which has just been added into the chat now. If you go through that, obviously there's chances to win. It'll basically, it's a good resource to share internally within the companies and your teams. And I believe there's a prize at the end of it for anyone who does enter. So a giveaway across that as well. Oh yeah, pack of ripples. That was it. Pack of ripples for the colleagues. There you go. I've turned over my page, and that's what you get us from that. Again, you've got the access on the additional resources, articles, guidance that we'll all send out as well. There's a previous webinar around instant response, which we've all gone through, and that was recording that's available as well. And again, I think if you combine the instant response to the supply chain side of things, it's a really, really good approach to take, especially in the current climate. And then we've also got next month, I want to say, our upcoming webinar, which is our final webinar in our 3-part series, which is all around MXDR. So managed extended detection and response. Am I right in that, Tom?
That sounds reasonable. Yeah, I think you got those numbers.
There you go. That can be my soundbite, and you can have the who, the what, the how, and the where, and the why. So again, that's the final series we've got, or final part of this 3-part series on webinars. See any questions, anything you need, then let us know. But thank you very much for all of your time today, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.